All right, thank you, Leslie. So I was asked to do a Bioenergy 101, which actually a long time ago, I was in the war room when we decided to do these. So that's just one of those things that comes around and goes around. And I actually teach an introductory level class, at Iowa State. So you guys can decide in the next 10 minutes whether or not you feel really happy or really terrible for those people who are signed up for that in the fall. So a beginner's guide to ecosystem modeling. What we do with ecosystem models sounds really cool, sounds really opaque, but actually it's basically a physical representation with math of how plants and soils interact with the atmosphere. So I took this image from Ben Peng's recent presentation, because I think it does a nice job of basically addressing the challenge at hand here. We have to go all the way from genetic information to plant cells, to leaves, to canopies, to fields, to watersheds, and the globe. And actually one of the cool things about ecosystem models was they're originally developed to answer big global questions like how much carbon does a biosphere take up? And some of the first tests that made people believe that they were actually doing a good job was you can't really validate the carbon cycle, but the water cycle is actually a lot easier to look at. So they ran models across the whole globe. They're doing carbon, water, nitrogen cycling, and then looked at how they predicted stream flow with those sort of balances. And they did it a halfway decent job. So that's about the only way that you can look at something on this scale. So it's a big task that they have to do. And to do so, I think there's this paradigm that our agricultural meteorology program uses to sort of slice apart the thinking about science. And ecosystem models are basically a mathematical representation of this philosophy. So science is characterized by the formulation and testing of hypotheses. I'll give you examples of how we've used our models to test and formulate hypotheses. The conservation laws dictate the flux of mass and energy between soil vegetation and the atmosphere. There's feedbacks. I really wanted to put a thermal image in my talk that showed this. You're gonna have to use your imagination because I didn't get in the talk in time. And of course, one of my favorite quotes, I want to get a quick show of hands. Who's heard this one before? Essentially all models are wrong, some are useful. Okay, cool, we're going about 50-50, so not everyone's heard that one before, but basically it's science in a nutshell, not just for models. So the real point of an ecosystem model is not just to get the answer here represented by the check mark on this diagram of how to get across the quad or how to improve plant photosynthesis, interpret it either way. The goal is to get there following the path that you probably should have followed. So if you take a black box or statistical approach and you don't use first principles to dictate how you get there, there's lots of paths to get there, but they're inefficient, they're wrong, and they could be perilous in the case of misrepresenting agroecosystems, as we'll show in a minute. So the goal is to use the physics, use our understanding of basic biophysics to follow one of the few paths that are right and not the other incorrect ones that sometimes you can get to when you use spurious correlations to get there. How do they do that? So they take all the physical processes that we think are important within this kind of cube or column. We make the world into these grids. We make them into 2D grids. We're finding out more and more important that the third dimension that dictates the flow of water is actually pretty important for differentiating the success of plants. And we turn them into a sequence of equations that are basically correlated with each other. They have to talk to each other through a systematic code. Back when I got into ecosystem modeling, a lot of people didn't use code, so I had to show them what code looked like. Now you all are using code, and computers are writing the code for you and that sort of thing. But the code still looks the same, so I'll show a fun picture of that in a minute. But basically, we have to cover the flux of water, carbon, and nitrogen in an interacting way that doesn't get rid of the conservation of energy and heat also. So it's a lot of earth, wind, heart, and fire to keep track at the same time. I forgot to say at the onset, Leslie challenged me, to get this 30-slide talk done in 10 minutes, so, buckle up. She did not challenge me to put as many memes or GIFs in as possible. I came up with that challenge for myself, because if you're gonna introduce people to stuff, you have to entertain them as well. I recently heard the phrase of an award-winning teacher, they call it edutainment, right? So if you guys are paying attention, you're much more likely to zone off and not learn anything. If anything, you get a little bit of free entertainment. So what do these models look like? This is some screenshots of the code, actually, Fortran. It's a series of interacting executable functions that are all coordinated and talk with each other. It's extremely fast. This language was developed 15 years before I was born. It still works, and it still cranks out code really fast. But it looks a little bit like Doogie Howser writing in his diary after each show. But I promise you, it does important, impactful things. What does it do? It takes processes like photosynthesis. Here's the basic nutshell of photosynthesis. There's some chemical reaction that we've seen many, many times. But it's not just a chemical reaction. It's a chemical reaction that depends on biology and physics along the way. So the task of ecosystem models is to say, how much photosynthesis, where in the canopy, how about what if it gets hotter, colder, windier, rainier along the way? What if we starve the plant of nutrients? What if there's an excess of of moisture, they have to take that basic mathematical, or that basic chemical equation and turn it into mathematical equations and distribute it throughout an ecosystem, which is a pretty cool task. How do they do it? They take known scalable reactions of enzymes across ranges of conditions and concentrations, and they talk to each other and say what's going on with the conditions across the ecosystem. They use laws like fixed laws of diffusion. They basically show how amazing plants are. If you do the math on how different the CO2 concentration is inside and outside a leaf, which is what plants are trying to get in, and how different the water concentration is inside and outside the leaf, you find that plants have to do an amazing thing, right? The concentration of CO2 inside and outside a leaf is 1,000 times smaller than the concentration gradient for water vapor. And on top of that, water vapor is a smaller molecule, so it actually moves inside and outside an opening at 1.6 times the ease, or the conductance along the way. So that means that it's basically a 1,000-to-1 job of getting a molecule of CO2 sequestered inside of a plant while losing water vapor along the way. Thankfully, there's a surplus of water in most situations, and they can pull off that physics. But it actually, when you think about it, it's a weird job they've assigned themselves, but biology figured it out for us, and we're just doing the math along the way. There's different types of plants. They use different pathways for photosynthesis, C3 and C4 photosynthesis, which many people are familiar in this room, and how they respond to CO2 concentrations inside the leaf within and light concentrations within a canopy will vary throughout every single day. So this is an example of the amount of light within a canopy that's shaded in the morning versus the afternoon throughout a profile. They're always changing, which affects the photosynthetic rate, which affects the heat transfer, which affects the water transfer, and the whole system is interlinked. And ecosystem models try to keep track of that for us. So here's an example of science being characterized by the formulation and testing of hypotheses. We took some of that flux data that Carl talked about earlier and compared it to our ecosystem model. Some of the black dots here are what the observations say. The blue dots are the model. And if you look at progression throughout this growing season, the dots are kind of in sync. But this is from 2012, when it went from this extremely dry period in the top panel to an alleviation of drought a few weeks later. The pictures on the right correspond to what the miscanthus literally looked like during that point. But the models thought the miscanthus was going to come back from that drought, which is showing this big negative carbon uptake in the blue dots, when in reality, the observations showed it being a carbon source. It was burnt out, man. It was out of water, and it couldn't do it anymore. So now we can have a hypothesis about the drought response of miscanthus and whether or not it changes its biology in response to this toward the future. It turns out, we actually have the rest of the data, and like an ogre, perennials have layers, right? That drought effect changed the trajectory of the growth of miscanthus for the next 15 years, or next 10 years to come, with greater allocation of photosynthate below ground and above ground, and that changes the water balance, the energy balance, going on and on and on. So that's a hypothesis then we can build into the model to test. If we change the representation of that, do we get better predictions? Conservation laws dictate the flow of mass throughout an ecosystem. Here's a simple cartoon of the nitrogen cycle for corn and soybeans. You'll see the soil source is very similar, but the balance is very different. Within CABBI, we tested if we inhibited the movement of nitrogen during the growing season, would it affect the losses of nitrogen we get? And what we found was the big losses of nitrogen happen outside the time when we can inhibit denitrification, according to the Descent model. So basically, it's taking up nitrogen and we're slowing it down at the time we don't need it to, and when we really need it to is outside the growing season. So then we use this kind of thinking of the conservation laws to say, well, what if we did this sort of biological nitrification inhibition outside the growing season with a cover crop on the shoulder seasons when the nitrogen losses are particularly high? This is where I wanted that photograph for the thermal image. You'll have to take some stomata and a graph instead. But let's talk about feedbacks. When you change stomatal conductance, you change the temperature and the CO2 concentration within the leaf, which changes the reaction rate of carboxylation. I've got all the math here that I suffer through when we do a breakout in class and do with the students. I'll let you just scan it real quickly and see it's yet another problem for plants to deal with. There's a lot more oxygen than there is carbon dioxide. And again, their job is to get carbon dioxide in, despite that heavy influence. I've got one meme here that's not for millennials or Gen Xers. This is I Love Lucy, which is from The Land Before Time. But basically, this is a GIF of Rubisco's job of trying to fix carbon while the favorability for that reaction goes down. So we put these sort of reactions into an ecosystem model and say, how does that affect the favorability for growing a perennial grass that uses a C4 photosynthetic pathway? If we take today's conditions, we say there's not that many places where we think miscanthus is clearly going to pencil out compared to the existing cropping system. But if you changed conditions, include more weather variability, higher temperatures, and greater precipitation events, and conserve those feedbacks within your ecosystem model, the area for opportunity basically expands. The probability that Miscanthus would outcompete a plant that's less well adapted for those conditions increases, and the benefit to the ecosystems for improved water quality and the prospects for that expand quite a bit. So it's a pretty cool application of that kind of science. The last one I have, how much time do I have, Leslie? 1 minute? The last one I have, I don't have enough time to go through in detail, but what we found was when we trained the model, added additional information that said we can't just let these parameters vary the way we like. They're going to follow the observations as taken by ecosystem measurements. They actually got a little bit worse, right? So it's useful because we could figure out why they weren't right, why they were wrong, and we're going to move forward with trying to change the misrepresentation of how leaves and photosynthesis work in plants to get a better representation that will help the ecosystem models going forward. So it was basically, we call this a misspecification, being right for the wrong reason. And I promised Theo that I would say, please measure specific leaf areas so we can help get this better in your measurements, because the ratio of width to depth of plant leaves actually makes a big impact on how you scale photosynthesis at a canopy level. It's just not a very interesting phenotype for those in the ecosystem sciences. So that's in a nutshell how ecosystem models address these paradigm and my thinking about science. If you have any questions, you can ask me. Thank you.